Now is a great time to get pre-qualified and start shopping.
Hello, Ben. How are you this evening?
Hello, is that Diane?
Yes, that's Diane. Have to change the name on it every
Hello.
week. Welcome. I'm glad
Nice
to
to
have
meet
you
you.
here. Nice to meet you too. Are you set with the PowerPoint or?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that you can see it. So I'm going to press share screen now.
All right.
Oh, disabled participant screen
Oh,
share.
just a second. I'm going to make you a co-host. That should do it.
Okay, will I try it now?
Yes.
Okay. Now, so
There we go.
can you see it now?
I can.
Okay, so will I
Good.
leave it like that?
Yes.
Okay. I might, is that the best format to display it? Can you read it and so on?
Yes, if you could make it full screen,
Yeah,
that would
I
enhance
forget
matters.
how to do that now. Wait a
You know,
minute.
my colleague Cynthia should be along any minute now, and she will tell you exactly how to do that.
Oh, okay. Is that right?
That's better. Yes.
Okay.
Very good. See, now you've jumped into the cyber age.
You're a very good teacher.
Right. Oh. Are you in class this semester or?
No, I'm
everybody's
on leave.
Zoom? Oh, well,
I-
that was good
Yeah,
timing.
I taught my classes last semester via Zoom,
Oh,
but I didn't get this sophisticated.
I understand. I was on sabbatical last semester, so this was my first on Zoom, and it was a rollicking
Okay.
beginning. I can tell you that.
Mhm. What discipline are you in?
Political science,
Okay, right.
comparative government.
Okay.
And I've been doing the lecture series here for about 7 years now. And that's been,
That's terrific.
it's
Yeah.
been wonderful. So many interesting people, so many horrific but fascinating stories to hear.
I was speaking to my former student, Ben Madley,
Oh,
this
yes.
afternoon, and he says that he's on your program as well. That's great.
Next week.
Oh, great.
He's following in your footsteps. He's been here several times and he's a wildly popular presenter. He does a beautiful job with the American genocide.
Yeah, he sure is good. Yeah,
Yes,
he was
he
a
is.
pleasure to teach.
I'm sure. I'm
And
sure.
his book is terrific.
Oh, it really is fabulous.
Mm.
So,
We're working together now on a 3-volume series, The Cambridge World History of Genocide.
oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
and,
exciting. Is it just
he's
the two of
working with
you
me on
or?
volume 2, and he's writing 2 chapters, and we're co-editing it together.
Oh, that's
along with 2 other
fantastic.
people.
Well, I look forward to seeing that. I hope we can stay in touch and you'll let me know when it's published.
Yeah, it should be published next August, a year from now.
Excellent.
Mm.
Excellent.
3 volumes.
Do you know
It's,
Jim
got-
Waller?
I'm sorry?
Do you know Jim Waller of Keene
Oh,
University?
yes, of course, yeah.
Well, he just published his book on Northern Ireland last Friday, and we were very.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, that's very interesting. Good for
Oh,
him.
yes,
It's very
indeed.
timely.
Yes,
Mm.
yes. And he was here last week giving his presentation on Becoming
great.
Evil. It's always
Yeah.
marvelous.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, yeah.
and this is
He's
my
a good
colleague.
scholar, very good scholar.
Oh, yes, he is. Can you see my colleague Cynthia? She's just joined us. And Cynthia, this is Dr. Ben.
Hello, Cynthia.
Kiernan.
Hi there, Ben. Nice to meet you. Welcome.
You too.
So Ben figured this all out
I'm
by
looking forward.
himself, and we don't need to have
Oh,
any
good.
urgent assistance, so I'm delighted.
Okay, then I'm going to go dark here and just observe, but it's great to have
All right.
you, and I'm looking forward to it, Ben.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. I'm just going to check the next slide to see if, okay, that's good. I know what to do now.
Moving along. Okay.
Mhm.
Well, that's great. How many courses are you teaching this semester?
No, I'm on leave. I usually
I'm
teach
sorry.
two.
Just told me two. Yes,
Yeah.
that's good.
I usually teach one on the history of genocide and one on Southeast Asia.
Uh-huh.
Quite often Vietnam or all of Southeast Asia.
I see.
But I usually include Cambodia in the history of genocide or in
Yes.
20th century Southeast Asia.
I just have to pick something up. I'll be right back.
Mhm.
So this is your first time in our lecture series. It's a shame you couldn't come out to Sonoma and enjoy our weather.
Oh, I'd love to do that. Yeah.
All right, good.
Although it's very pretty here right now.
Is it? You're not freezing.
No, it's spring, definitely. We had a deer in our backyard just this afternoon.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
That's
just an
great.
hour ago. Mm.
Do you live right in New Haven?
Just across the border in Hamden,
Oh, okay.
very close,
Oh.
a short bus ride to Yale. But the university is shut down now.
Yeah.
Nobody's working in the office.
No.
Everyone's working from home.
Yes.
Most of the classes are via Zoom. But I've been on leave, and so I've only just come back last month from Ireland.
Ah. Are
And
you
I've
working
been
on
working
something?
on this 3-volume
Oh, the
series?
yes.
Cambridge,
Yes.
yeah.
So where were you in Ireland?
In Kerry in the southwest.
Oh,
It's
very nice.
it's a good place to spend a pandemic year.
Yes, indeed.
I'm a big Ireland fan. Ireland's like my second home, and I usually go to West Cork, but Southern Kerry is
Oh, isn't
like
it good?
unbeatable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which
We were actually
which
there
town or
for
village were you
15
in?
months. The pandemic started in March. We got there in February, and the pandemic started the next month. So we spent the whole time in South Kerry.
Oh,
we did-
darn.
We did sneak into West Cork once. That was it.
Where exactly, which town or village were you in?
Kenmare.
Oh my God, you were in Kenmare.
Well-
That's one of my favorites.
Oh yes, a lovely town.
Oh,
But we hardly went in there.
Mm.
We're about 10 minutes out in a small valley called Dromocty, not far from Kenmare.
oh, wow.
About 20 farms surrounded by
Wow.
trees.
Beautiful.
I know exactly what you're talking about. That's just, oh, I'm so
Uh-huh.
jealous.
You know the Sailor's Bar?
Is it downtown in Kenmare? I do,
No, it's-
actually.
It's about 10 minutes out along the road to Allahees and Iries
Mhm.
and Castletown Bear.
I can't
so-
picture it in my head, but I've been by it a
Oh,
million times, I'm sure.
Right.
Oh, that's so exciting.
Where do you go in West Cork?
Sheepshead Peninsula is
that's
where I
not
usually,
far. Yeah,
is
that's
where I
lovely.
usually live, near Bantry.
Yeah.
Um, but also kind of in the middle of nowhere.
Okay.
Mhm.
No, it's beautiful there. It's warmer than the rest of Ireland. Sunnier
Mhm.
on the Gulf
Yeah.
Stream. Palm trees grow.
Yeah. When I was first there for my sabbatical a few years ago, and I arrived on September 1st. I had never been to Ireland before. Now I've been there 6 or 7 times since because I fell in love with it so much. But I got there September 1st and it didn't rain for the first 3 weeks I was there. So I just assumed like all of this, it rains all the time in Ireland thing was just a myth that they told us to keep us out, you know? And it was just so green and sunny and beautiful. And then finally, then the rain came and then it was crazy. My road, the road up to the house I lived in actually washed out from really heavy rains. About a mile of the road just gone, and there was no other way out because it was just this one-way road like they have everywhere. And I was thinking, you know, as a Californian, it was going to take months to get it fixed, right? We were going to have to get helicoptered out because they'd have to get all these approvals and, you know, civilian conservation corps in and everything. No, they just had like Patrick up the road with his front loader just brought a bunch of, you know, bunch of rocks and just piled it up with gravel. And within like 24 hours, we had a road again.
Well, it's not just the rain, it's the wind as well. Very high winds in January, February, March. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Ben, if you're ready, it's about time.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Good evening, everybody. We're delighted to be able to welcome Professor Ben Kiernan this evening. Dr. Kiernan comes to us from Yale University, where he is the A. Whitney Grizzle Professor of History. Within a broad canon of scholarly work, Dr. Kiernan is the author of Blood and Soil, A World History of Genocide and Extermination from Sparta to Darfur, which won the gold medal for the best work of history awarded by the Independent Publishers Association. Dr. Kiernan has written How Pol Pot Came to Power, Colonialism, Nationalism, and Communism in Cambodia, 1930 to 1975, and The Pol Pot Regime, Race, Power, and Genocide in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, 1975 to 1979. His most recent book is Vietnam, A History from Earliest Times to the Present. His vast work in Southeast Asian studies has received a multitude of accolades. Professor Kiernan is the founding director of the Cambodian Genocide Program at Yale. He subsequently established their Comparative Genocide Studies program. In 1995, a Khmer Rouge court indicted, tried, and sentenced Dr. Kiernan for, quote, prosecuting and terrorizing the Cambodian resistance patriots. We are grateful that the judgment was rendered in absentia, and we are very pleased to have Dr. Kiernan here this evening to share his insight into the Cambodian genocide. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure to be here. I've set out in my first slide 10 of the 10 points that I'm going to talk about tonight. I think I'll just go through them briefly to describe an outline of my presentation, focusing on the organization of the Cambodian genocides during the Pol Pot period, and focusing on how it was that the Pol Pot regime conducted this genocide, how they were able to carry them out. And first, I'll give a legal description of the genocides and crimes against humanity that they perpetrated. And then looking back on a historical account of the rise of the regime, its reign of terror, and its fall of this regime known as DK, or Democratic Kampuchea. And then an analysis of the administrative and geographic structures, which are very important, how they organized their regime and how they divided up the country among their administrative structures, led by the ruling party, the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the CPK. And then I'll give a brief overview of the purges within that party, led by the top level of the party, the Pol Pot group. And then an analysis of the ideology that propelled those purges, and then the genocides that occurred once they took power. And then the death tolls that resulted from these purges and genocides and crimes against humanity. And then I'll go through the various genocides against domestic ethnic minorities, the ethnic Vietnamese community, the Cham Muslim community, and ethnic Chinese. And then we'll get to what I think is the most important for tonight's talk is the mechanisms of the genocides, how they were organized. And to give you an idea of what I'll be arguing, there are three ways in which the Khmer Rouge leadership of Pol Pot and his group conducted or carried out the genocide, three mechanisms that I'll be focusing on. Firstly, the way they excluded certain people whom they didn't trust from the top level of their organization. The organization, the ruling party was the CPK, the Communist Party of Kampuchea. But of course that had a central committee, but it never met. And the central committee had a standing committee, but certain people were excluded from that standing committee meetings, the meetings of it. And we'll see how that was done. Secondly, there was a geographic favoritism. Certain regions of the country were put in the hands of loyalists to the Pol Pot leadership, and those regions were favored, and they tended to be under the control of people who I will call warlords, that is military commanders rather than political party leaders, people who rose to the top through the military. And those regions were put into the hands of their military commanders rather than their political leaders. So that's the second mechanism of the genocide. And thirdly, I'll show towards the end how the genocide was conducted by the compilation of lists of people according to their ethnicity. And the ethnicity of people was gathered, lists of their names were compiled, and then people were exterminated based on their ethnicity. And then moving from that, those genocides against ethnic minorities, point 9 is the genocide that happened against what I call part of a national group. This is the definition of the United Nations Genocide Convention of 1948, which came into force as international law in 1951. That is, acts committed with the intent to destroy an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group in whole or in part as such, including killing members of the group. And I will show that acts were committed with intent to destroy part of a national group, that is the national group of Cambodia, the ethnic majority who were Khmer, 80% of the population. Part of that group was subjected to killing members of the group with the intent to destroy them as such, a part of the group. And I'll explain which part I have in mind. And then finally, the genocide of a religious group, again, of the Khmer majority, the Buddhist monkhood. Okay.
Ben, could I ask you, could you?
2018, the United Nations sponsored extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, ECCC, found that 2 genocides had occurred in Cambodia during the rule of Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime from 1975 to 79. The trial chamber of the ECCC's hybrid international/national court, it contains both Cambodian judges and UN-appointed international judges. The trial chamber convicted the 2 surviving top leaders of the Pol Pot regime. It found both Nguyen Chia, Pol Pot's number 2, and Khieu Samphan, the regime's head of state from 1976 to 79, guilty of the genocide of Cambodia's ethnic Vietnamese minority. Khieu Samphan thus became the first head of state in the world to be convicted of genocide in an international court. The trial chamber of the ECCC also found Nguyen Chia guilty of the genocide of the country's ethnic Cham Muslim minority. Both these men, The two most senior surviving leaders of the Pol Pot regime were convicted as well of at least 3 counts of crimes against humanity, as well as of genocide. And these counts were of murder and extermination of ethnic Vietnamese, but also of their, quote, persecution on racial grounds. And the court found in the cases of both Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan, quote, that the intended discriminatory acts were deliberate killing of Vietnamese on a large scale. Now, the ECCC had previously, 4 years before, in 2014, convicted both these men of crimes against humanity for other crimes, the persecution and mass murder of their country's Khmer majority population. And so they were already serving life sentences in Phnom Penh when these genocide convictions and additional crimes against humanity convictions were registered in 2018. Now, these ECCC legal determinations and convictions were the culmination of 4 decades of national and international efforts to bring the Khmer Rouge leaders to justice. But their regime's rise to power and their crimes had commenced much earlier. Now, here's a map of Southeast Asia, just showing where Cambodia is in between Thailand and Vietnam, in the mainland region of Southeast Asia. And here is a map, a digital elevation map of Cambodia, again showing Vietnam to the east and Thailand to the west and north of Cambodia. In 1967, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge launched an insurgency against the Cambodian regime of Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Here is Pol Pot as a guerrilla leader. That insurgency escalated in 1970 when the Vietnam War spilled over across the border from Vietnam into Cambodia, bringing 3 years of international conflict to the previously neutral kingdom of over 7 million people, mostly Khmer Buddhists. As I mentioned, 80% of the population were Khmer Buddhists. The Khmer Rouge forces then grew from several thousand guerrillas in 1969 to more than 200,000 troops and militia in 1973. Here are some of the other leaders of Pol Pot's Communist Party of Kampuchea: Son Sen on the left, Ieng Sary, Nguyen Chia, Pol Pot's number 2, and Mok, the military commander. And these people completed their conquest of Cambodia with the capture of Phnom Penh on April 17th, 1975. There is Khieu Samphan, who became head of state, and as I mentioned, along with Nguyen Chia, he was found guilty of genocide just 3 years ago now. But how did they come to power? They were a very small guerrilla force in 1969, but in 1965, the United States began tactical bombing of Cambodia across the border in an attempt to neutralize Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. But in 1969, that escalated to strategic bombing with big B-52 strategic forces. And the bombing slowly spread across Cambodia from 1969 to 1973. And these are the more than 115,000 bombing points of Cambodia that were struck by US Air Force planes in the period 1965 to 1973. The Pentagon kept a very detailed database of all the bombing points that were struck, but not everyone was known. In other words, the Pentagon, in many cases, in fact, all of these cases, the pilots and the targeters back in Guam or Thailand who set the planes up in the air to bomb locations in Cambodia, in 12,500 cases, didn't know what they were bombing. According to the Pentagon database, 12,500 targets which were bombed, the locations were unknown. And this is a map of those targets. In many cases, villages were hit, funerals, weddings, peasants were killed. My estimate is between 50,000 and 150,000 Cambodian civilians, mostly peasants, were killed. And this would enable the Khmer Rouge to blame the United States and indeed the Lon Nol regime, which was its ally, for the bombing. They even told their peasant followers that the killing birds came from Phnom Penh, which was a lie. They were coming from Thailand or from Guam or the Philippines. And they blamed the Phnom Penh government of Lon Nol for the bombing that the peasants were suffering. And they were able to recruit, as I mentioned, a large army of more than 200,000, in part because of the bombing, in part because of the support of Prince Sihanouk, who joined forces with them, and in part because of the support of the Vietnamese communists who were at that point allied with them. And in 1975, as I mentioned, they seized power. They then immediately emptied all of Cambodia's cities, along with its hospitals and Buddhist monasteries. They shut down its schools, newspapers, postal service, and most of its factories. They dynamited the National Bank. This is a picture I took of it in 1980. And they abolished money and wages. The new state of Democratic Kampuchea, or DK, was officially proclaimed in January 1976, and it became a vast agricultural labor camp. The cities were almost empty. Family life came under rigid controls, and soon Cambodians had to take their meals in collective mess halls. A 12-year-old peasant boy, whom the Khmer Rouge had separated from his parents in 1977, told me 2 years later that the Khmer Rouge had been, quote, killing people every day, unquote. Most of the killings occurred in secret, much like the administration of the entire country of DK. For instance, Pol Pot, the country's new leader, never admitted that his real name was Salot Saw. As a Cambodian activist student in Paris in 1952, Saw had selected a different false name. He called himself, as a nom de plume, Khmer Dam, the original Khmer. Now, fellow Cambodian leftist students in Paris in the early 50s had preferred less racial, more modernist code names like Khmer Sere, Free Khmer, or Khmer Ngir, Khmer Worker. But Salot Saw's choice prefigured his particular prejudice against other ethnic groups. He called himself the original Khmer. His French scholarship ended after he failed his radio electricity course, and he returned to Cambodia in 1953. During the 1960s, Salot Saw and other younger, mostly French-educated Cambodian communists took over the leadership of what had been a more orthodox Marxist, relatively pro-Vietnamese Workers' Party of Kampuchea. That was its name then. Under its previous name, the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party, which was its name in the 1950s, it had led the country's independence struggle against French colonialism, while these people were still students in Paris. In 1966, this new younger leadership changed the party's name to Communist Party of Kampuchea, its third name, CPK. And they set out on their path to power by staging the 1967 uprising against Prince Sihanouk's neutralist government. When the Cambodian Army General and Prime Minister Lon Nol overthrew Sihanouk in March 1970, the prince took up exile in Beijing, and as I mentioned, he backed his erstwhile opposition, whom he had dubbed Khmer Rouge, Red Khmers, and in 1975 they defeated and overthrew Lon Nol's US-backed Khmer Republic. Their own state of DK, Democratic Kampuchea, was in turn overthrown by a Vietnamese invasion on January 7th, 1979, ending the Khmer Rouge era. So how is this government run, this DK? We had both administrative and geographic structures, which I want to outline now. The official DK ruling body was the Standing Committee of the Central Committee of the CPK. However, in actual practice, the leaders with maximum national power and responsibility for the mass murders, crimes against humanity, and the genocides perpetrated in 75 to 79 were those leaders who were based in the capital, Phnom Penh. It was this group that made up what was called the party centre, Machimpak, and they included Solotsor or Pol Pot, Secretary General of the CPK since 1962, and Prime Minister of DK. Secondly, Nguyen Chia, Deputy Secretary General of the CPK since 1960. Third, Ieng Sary, ranked number 3 in the party leadership since 1963, and he became one of DK's deputy prime ministers responsible for foreign affairs. Vaughan Vet, number 5 in the party hierarchy, he was deputy DK prime minister for the economy. And Son Sen, there they are, Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia, Ieng Sary, and Son Sen from left to right. And here is Son Sen's number 8 in the hierarchy. He became Deputy DK Prime Minister for Defence and Security. And then Khieu Samphan, you can see him, number 9 on the table there, party member since the 1950s, also studied in Paris, along with Solotsor, Ieng Sary, and Ieng Tirit, number 11, wife of Ieng Sary and DK Minister of Social Action. And then Son Sen's wife, Yun Yat, was number 12. This table here, the first part of the table, shows 2 other very high-ranking members of the CPK Standing Committee who held regional posts, numbers 4 and 6. But partly they were zone chiefs, in other words, Secretary of the Eastern Zone, Sao Pim, and of the Northwest Zone, Ruh Nim. You'll notice that nearly all the others held central posts in Phnom Penh. But partly because those regional responsibilities mostly kept them away from the capital, these 2 leaders, numbers 4 and 6, did not play major roles in the party centre, which held its meetings in Phnom Penh. Sao Pim, number 4 in the CPK hierarchy, and Ruh Nim, number 6, were the CPK secretaries of the East and Northwest zones, respectively. These were the country's 2 most economically productive and important zones. Sao Pim spent most of his time in the agriculturally rich Eastern Zone, which had a large population of 1.7 million. He appears not to have attended any of the Standing Committee meetings in a key period after victory, the year between September 1975 and August 1976. Sao Pim is listed as present at none of its 14 meetings for which the minutes survive, from October 75 to May 76. And then after that, he missed all of its meetings over the following 3 months because he spent that period undergoing medical treatment in China. Moreover, the CPK Central Committee, as I mentioned, appears never to have met. Although its key role was assumed by the Standing Committee, that role was actually played by the party centre, as I mentioned, by those Standing Committee members who held national level posts in Phnom Penh. Unlike Sao Pim and Ruh Nim, these people were based in the capital and available to attend meetings there, which occurred every 7 to 10 days. So the frequent absences of Sao Pim, number 4, and Ruh Nim, number 6, from meetings of the Standing Committee meant that these 2 men, who were actually the most senior veteran communist leaders, who ran the country's two most populous and productive zones, were largely excluded from the key national decisions secretly made by the CPK Centre. There may have been a political motive as well as a geographic reason for their exclusion from this key decision-making body, the party centre. These two veterans disagreed with the centre's 1975 decision to close the markets and evacuate the cities. Their diminished political status, as absent from the party centre meetings, was later formalised by denying them full rights membership of the Standing Committee, and they were relegated to what's called candidate membership, a second lower level membership of the Standing Committee. By contrast, two other CPK figures, we'll go back to the who in 1975-76 also held regional party posts similar to those of Salpem and Ruhnim, but enjoyed the favour of Pol Pot's centre group, did increasingly assume national posts as well, and took up responsibility for the implementation of both military and genocidal policies throughout the country. And this is number 7, Mock, sometimes known as Tar Mock or Grandfather Mock. He was number 9 in the party in 1963, but he rose to number 7, and he took over as CPK secretary of the key Southwest Zone in 1973. He would also assume national prominence as commander of the army, of the Revolutionary Army of Kampuchea, and later would even rise to number 3 position in the Standing Committee, immediately after Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia. Mock became the only CPK leader based outside of Phnom Penh to enjoy full rights membership of the Standing Committee, along with Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia, and Ieng Sary, who are all based in Phnom Penh. And in addition, Kai Pok, who there is number 13 in the CPK hierarchy, became party secretary of the Central Zone of DK in 1976, and later rose to become deputy leader of the army, Under Secretary General of the Revolutionary Army of Kampuchea. And I'll talk later about the key military and political roles of these two people, Mock and Pok, and in particular of Mock's Southwest Zone forces in the spread of genocidal massacres across Cambodia. Both Mock and Pok, as I mentioned earlier, were warlord figures, and I mean this in 2 senses. First, they were originally military commanders, and they rose to control their respective zones, the Southwest and the North, by overshadowing or purging their own zones' political leadership. And second, especially in Mock's case, they ruled through the appointment of close family members, peppering their zones, especially Mock, with relatives. And they did this with centre support. So we have a situation where the party's centre is run from Phnom Penh by people based in Phnom Penh only. And it excludes members of the Standing Committee, whom those people in Phnom Penh don't trust, who run zones, except for favoured rulers of zones who are brought into the centre by making them commander and deputy commander of the army, the national army. And so there is a manipulation of the Standing Committee by Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia, and their centre colleagues to exclude the senior veterans of the party and include military personnel from other zones. So along with Mock's promotion in the Standing Committee and the demotions of Salpem and Ruhnim, an early example of the centre's favouritism towards Mock and the Southwest Zone was territorial. And here is what I just showed you before was the official Cambodian language map of the zones. This is an English version for clarity there. You can see the southwest zone, the eastern zone run by Saupim, the northwest run by Ruhnim. That's Mok's southwest zone. But originally, the southwest zone included all that crosshatched area there, and the east included all the orange area there. Before 1970, that was the situation. And the eastern zone included 6 regions numbered 20 to 25, as you can see there. But then in 1971, the center created its own wartime special zone around Phnom Penh. I've written in the letters SZ for, and you can see region 25 has been taken from the east and given to the center zone special zone, along with regions 15 and 33 taken from the southwest. However, after the 1975 victory and the dismantling of the special zone, the center did not return region 25 to the east, but transferred it to Mok, to the southwest zone instead. Again, this is territorial favoritism against veteran leaders that the party center of Pol Pot did not trust towards military commanders like Mok, especially Mok, whom it was promoting. This leads us to the internal purges of the party. The CPK Center was known as Angkar Le, the High Organization, and it may have begun its violent internal purges as early as the 1960s by assassinating party figures considered too close to the Vietnamese communists. There remains some doubt about whether in 1962 an insider, perhaps Salot Saw, Pol Pot himself, had betrayed his then superior, the party secretary Tu Samut, the Secretary General of the Workers' Party, to Sihanouk's and Lon Nol's police, who murdered Samut in 1962. But by 1974, the CPK Center demonstrably failed to share the loyalty to Samut's memory that was shown by the Eastern Zone CPK branch, that's Saupim's branch. And in 1978, it retrospectively, the center retrospectively accused Tu Samut of having been a Vietnamese puppet. But then it quickly withdrew and attempted to erase that accusation, perhaps because of something the accusation might reveal about what had led to Samut's murder. This suggests to me a cover-up of the center's view that Tu Samut was a Vietnamese puppet, which it did express, but they quickly covered it up because it suggested they were involved in his murder, perhaps by betraying him to the police who did murder him. Then in the early 1970s, before taking power at the national level, the center organized the arrest and disappearances of approximately 900 Hanoi-trained Khmer communists who had come home to Cambodia from North Vietnam to join the insurgency against Lon Nol's regime. They'd accounted for half the party's membership in 1970. They were mostly murdered. The next step was to sideline and eventually purge the distrusted CPK zone leaderships, the veteran communists like Saupim and Ruhnim and others less prominent, who also had once associated with the Vietnamese communists. But these zone chiefs were more domestically entrenched. They had following in their zones, especially Saupim and Ruhnim. DK was initially divided into 6 major zones, Pumipir, and 32 regions or sectors, each of which in turn comprised districts, sub-districts, and villages. Now, an eventual aim of the CPK Center at the local level was to build larger and larger units, abolishing village life altogether in favor of what they called high-level cooperatives, Sahakor Kamrit Kapur, each the size of a sub-district, not of a village, involving the erasure of private family autonomy and the imposition of communal meals in public mess halls, as I mentioned. Meanwhile, at the top end of the hierarchy, the centre set about reducing the autonomy of the zones by bringing them under its own direct control from above. The centre gradually exerted totalitarian control over both the population and the administration by replacing autonomous or dissident zone administrations and party committees with centre-backed forces commanded by the loyalist zone leaders Mock from the southwest and Polk from the north. From 1972 to mid-1978, these and other purges took the lives of half of the members of the party central committee, very similar to Stalin's purges in the Soviet Union. From 1973, with centre backing, Mock began to seize control of the Southwest Zone Party Committee, first executing his party senior, Prerequisite, who was an ethnic Thai, who had ranked as high as number 7 in the 1963 party hierarchy. In 1976, Mock sent his brutal daughter, Kom, to help run what had been Prerequisite's Region 11, which you can see there in the west on the coast, a largely ethnic Thai area on the border of Thailand in Western Cambodia. Then in 1975, the centre created a new Western zone, quote, which it called, quote, our poorest zone, having poor soil and little water. You can see the W for the Western zone, which had previously been part of the Southwest. This deprived zone was assigned to Chuchet, the veteran chairman of what had been the Southwest Zone. Chuchet was, until then, Mock's superior. Remember, Mock was the military commander, but not the political leader of the Southwest until this point. And Chuchet was Mock's remaining rival. And Mock's forces had ambushed and slightly wounded Chuchet in 1973. The centre now demoted Chuchet to CPK secretary of this impoverished Western Zone. For his part, Mock now gained full control of the populous, productive rump of the Southwest, which you can see on the map there. It has 2.5 times the population of the Western Zone, 50% more rice land, and all the nation's salt pans, very important, a monopoly of salt in Cambodia. And it was from this strong economic base with unchallenged power and strong centre backing that Mock's Southwest Zone forces were able to expand in 1977 and 1978 to take over almost all the rest of Cambodia, as we'll see. What about the North? Also after the 1975 victory, Kai Polk's forces carried out a violent purge of the Northern Zone. Deploying his military forces, Polk displaced cadres loyal to his predecessor, Khoi Tuan, CPK secretary of the Northern Zone, who was first transferred to Phnom Penh, then arrested and later executed. The North was now renamed the Central Zone, which you can see on the map there. From late 1976, over 100 of Mock's Southwest Zone cadres arrived in the North to assist in Polk's takeover of the North, now the centre. In 1977, Southwest cadres carried out a similar purge of Ruth Nyim's Northwest Zone as well. And then in early 1978, they took over Chuchet's Western Zone. The people arrested, and this is how the Southwest Zone took over all of these zones that you can see on the map there. The people arrested were taken to the nerve centre of the CPK system, the National Security Service Sontebal, as it was called, the National Secret Police prison in Phnom Penh, codenamed Office S21, after S meaning Sontebal. And there it is, a picture I took in 1980. Up to 15,000 people, mostly suspected CPK dissidents and regional officials who were killed or arrested in these purges that I'm talking about here, mostly conducted by Southwest Zone forces. Up to 15,000 of them were tortured and killed in this prison from 1976 to 79. The Sontebale chief, Kain Iu, alias Duke, reported directly first to Son Sen, Deputy DK Prime Minister for Defence and Security, and then from August 1977 to Nguyen Chia, Pol Pot's number 2. S21 was the centre of a national network of prisons and the nearby mass graves where the murdered prisoners' bodies were buried. Finally, in May 1978, the centre armed forces, commanded by Son Sen, Polk, and Mok, launched a conventional military suppression campaign that overran Sao Pim's eastern zone. Pim, number 4 in the party hierarchy since 1963, committed suicide in early June 1978. The centre's struggle for total control was finally complete, but it had sown the seeds of its own overthrow. Surviving officials and troops of the Eastern Zone rose in rebellion, and in late 1978, they crossed the Vietnamese border with tens of thousands of followers. They requested the Vietnamese military assistance that soon brought DK to an end. This map shows the location of the prisons and mass grave sites and how close they were to each other. The blue triangles are prisons and the white circles are mass grave sites, and they're very close to one another. The mass graves nearly always relate to the prisoners' bodies. I'll just leave that table of the approximate death tolls in all of these purges and genocides for you to peruse. What I want to look now at is the ideology that brought about these mass murders and genocides. Along with totalitarian Stalinist and Maoist models, the political worldview of the Pol Pot group encompassed an obsession with Cambodian national and racial revivalism and grandiosity. The CPK leaders would recover Cambodia's original pre-Buddhist glory, surpass the powerful economy of the medieval Angkor Kingdom, and regain its, quote, lost territory from both Vietnam and Thailand. French colonialism had exaggerated this Cambodian sense of glory lost. For instance, I want to get, sorry about this, there's the Angkor Wat, the largest religious building in the world. And here is a sculpture group erected in the 1920s at the stairway below Marseille railway station. It depicts on the left a recumbent Cambodian apsara, or a celestial dancer, being attended upon by a prostrate Vietnamese boy in the foreground, and behind him, a Lao girl. The statuary elevates Cambodia to the privileged position, superior to that of Vietnam and Laos. French colonial ideology aimed to preserve Khmer culture, particularly Angkor Wat, and to emphasize Cambodia's historic role in Southeast Asia by excavating and studying the ancient monuments of Angkor and medieval Cambodia. This colonial ideology was, however, partly designed to keep restless Vietnamese in their place under French rule. It was also perfectly suited to encourage the young Salat Sor, Pol Pot, to dream of recasting himself as the original Khmer. Pol Pot arrived in Marseille in September 1949 by ship from Saigon. It is easy to imagine him climbing the stairway past this statue to catch his first train to Paris, carefully studying this sculpture group depicting Cambodia's superiority to Vietnam. Born in 1925, Pol Pot had reached adulthood in French Indochina under the wartime pro-Nazi Vichy administration. He and Kusampon attended a Cambodian high school where every morning the pupils had to salute the Nazi ally Marshal Pétain with the words, Maréchal, nous voilà, here we are, Marshal. Pétainist agrarian ideology also percolated into Cambodia, as this poster from the Pétain period in France indicates. It is apparent also, this agrarian ideology is apparent in Kusampon's Paris doctoral dissertation on Cambodia's economy, which he completed in 1959. It emphasized relying on Cambodia's domestic agricultural resources and separating Cambodia from other nations' economies, which is indeed what the Pol Pot regime did when it took power in 1975. This too suited Pol Pot's idea of falling back on the original Cambodia. The DK state treasured the Cambodian race, not individuals. As Pol Pot put it in 1979, we are not worried that the source of our army would become exhausted because the local population is very numerous, in other words, expendable. Khmer peasant casualties were not a problem. National impurities were a problem. The latter included the foreign educated, except of course for Pol Pot's own Paris educated group, and those whom the centre called hereditary enemies, particularly Vietnamese. To return Cambodians to their imagined origins, the Pol Pot group saw the need for war and for, quote, secrecy as the basis of the revolution. You can see why a few of the grassroots, more pragmatic, peasant background, Buddhist educated, veteran Cambodian communists could be trusted to implement such plans, which indeed Pol Pot kept secret from them. The party centre, with its elite urban background, mostly French education, Nguyen Chia was the exception. He was educated in Bangkok at the Thammasat University, and a racial chauvinism little different from that of the Lon Nol regime, inhabited a different ideological world from that of the more moderate, as I mentioned, Buddhist educated, Vietnamese trained peasant cadres who'd made up the mass of the party's membership, including even most zone leaders like Sao Pim and Ruot Nhim. The centre's acknowledged lack of a political base for its own program meant that it considered tactics of secrecy and violence necessary. And these were used first against suspected party dissidents and then against the people of Cambodia as a whole. Given the sacrifices from the population that this nationalist or racialist revival required, the resistance it naturally provoked, and the regime's preparedness to forge ahead, quote, at all costs, unquote, mass murder and genocides were the results. And I'll just return to that. From April 1975 to January 1979, Cambodia's population of 7.9 million declined by at least 1.67 million. In a 2009 report, which I'll refer to later, commissioned by the ECCC's co-investigating judges, the UN demographic expert from the tribunal in The Hague concluded that 1.75 million was the most likely minimum death toll. In its 2019 judgment, the ECCC trial chamber wrote, experts accept estimates falling between 1.5 and 2 million excess deaths as the most probable. These deaths were caused by mass killings, starvation, disease, and overwork. The regime's military and security forces deliberately killed 1/3 to 1/2 of the victims, possibly 700,000 to 800,000 people. The other causes of mass death may also be blamed on the regime, which not only imposed a system of large-scale forced population displacement, including evacuation of the cities, and forced labor in the countryside, but it also exported rice and rejected international food and medical aid for Cambodia's people. Now, not all of this high death toll, about 21% of Cambodia's 1975 population of nearly 8 million, can be classified as genocide under the UN legal definition of that crime. Many of the victims belong to political and social groups that are not protected by the UN Genocide Convention. These include civilian officials of the defeated Lon Nol regime, its surrendered former officers and soldiers, and class enemies, as they were called, targeted by the regime, such as capitalists or exploiting classes. The persecutions and killings of members of these groups may be best classified as cases of extermination, which is a crime against humanity. But what about the cases of genocide? The largest ethnic minority groups in Cambodia before 1970 were the Vietnamese, the Chinese, the Muslim Cham, the Thai, and the Lao. Most other communist states set up, at least temporarily, or sometimes for quite a long time, supposedly autonomous ethnic minority regions, autonomous zones or regions. But the Pol Pot regime's view of Cambodia's 25 national minorities, who had long comprised up to 20% of the Cambodian population, was virtually to deny their existence. There were never any autonomous ethnic regions in DK. The regime instead officially and falsely proclaimed that minorities total only 1% of the population, not 20%. Statistically, they were written off, and their physical fate was much worse. I estimated that up to 100% of the ethnic Vietnamese who had remained in Cambodia after 1976 under DK, along with 50% of the country's ethnic Chinese, 36% of the Muslim Chams, and 40% of each of the Thai and Lao minorities perished. And in the 2009 demographic report, the authors concurred with these figures as the most likely estimates, while specifically noting the loss of almost all Vietnamese remaining in Cambodia after 1975. This picture I'm showing you now is a Vietnamese identity card from the early 1950s that ethnic Vietnamese were required to carry, even under previous regimes. But there had never been before a genocide of ethnic Vietnamese like what happened in the Pol Pot period. Members of Cambodia's 450,000 strong population of ethnic Vietnamese had never been granted citizenship, and over half of them had been expelled by the Lon Nol regime in 1970, with several thousand killed. And then about 150,000 more were driven out by the Pol Pot regime in 1975. But 20,000 stayed, many of them married to Cambodians, and they were simply murdered in 77 and 78. This was a clear case of genocide, where the DK regime intended to destroy an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group as such, and this is the definition of the UN Convention, and carried out its intent by killing members of such a group, in whole or in part. The April 1977 issue of the CPK magazine, Tung Pariwat, or Revolutionary Flags, published what the ECCC co-investigating judges termed a direct call, quote, a direct call to kill all members of the Vietnamese community remaining in Cambodia. That's in April 1977. It called for the masses to seek out and smash Kum Tik, which means kill in Khmer Rouge jargon, and that stated, as for their old roots, quote, some of whom still remain after we have smashed them to bits, it is imperative to whip up the people to sweep more of them clean and make things permanently clean. The co-investigating judges further alleged, quote, evidence of implementation of the policy is contained in communications from the zone level to the center. Former cadres also confirmed the policy. Wherever there were Vietnamese, quote, everyone had to be careful and to find them and to sweep them up, unquote. The ECCC trial chamber, in convicting the two top Khmer Rouge leaders, Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan, of the genocide of ethnic Vietnamese, found that, quote, the CPK upper echelon ordered the identification of Vietnamese, as a result of which, from April 1975, lists and biographies were prepared by the lower echelons and then communicated back to the upper echelon for further action, unquote. In mixed families, the CPK targeted Vietnamese mothers and their children while sparing Khmer fathers, and targeted Vietnamese fathers while sparing Khmer mothers and children. Until late 76, the Vietnamese community was targeted for expulsion from Cambodia, but from April 77, according to the trial chamber's genocide judgment, the Vietnamese community was targeted, quote, for destruction as such. From then on, quote, deliberate killings occurred on a mass scale, systematically organized and directed against the Vietnamese. These killings of Vietnamese civilians occurred on boats in DK waters from mid-77 and on March 19th, 1978, in Kampong Chnang province in 1977, in Soi Rieng province in 1978, in Kracheh province in September 1978, and at Wat Ksai in Siem Reap province in late 1978. In each case, quote, the court found, Vietnamese were targeted not as individuals, but based on their membership of the group and their perceived ethnicity, unquote. These crimes rose to the level of extermination, as well as the additional crime against humanity of persecution on racial grounds and genocide. Significantly now, the arrival of MOC's Southwest Zone cadres, who purged the Northwest Zone in mid-1977, had a dramatic effect on the ethnic Vietnamese minority there, as elsewhere. A person from Region 5 in the Northwest Zone, which you'll remember was Ruth Nhim's zone until he was purged. This person from Region 5 in the Northwest recalled, quote, they were searching out Vietnamese to arrest. When they found any Vietnamese, they took them away and killed them. When asked to specify, you have said that the Vietnamese in your unit were taken to be killed, this person replied, that happened after the Southwest group arrived. They researched people's biographies to find the Vietnamese, and when they discovered someone was Vietnamese, they would take them to be killed, unquote. The trial chamber also found that, quote, following a screening process aimed at implementing a nationwide policy to exterminate the Vietnamese, further killings of Vietnamese occurred in the Western Zone in July 78, as evidenced by the telegram dated 4th of August 1978, in which Office 401 reported to the party centre that in Region 37 in the Western Zone, this was after Chu Chet had been arrested in March of 1978, taken to Tuol Sleng, tortured and killed, and the Southwest Zone had taken over the Western Zone. In Region 37, 100 Vietnamese, as you can read there, 100 Vietnamese people, small and big, young and old, have been smashed, kamtik, which means killed. Under DK, the ethnic Chinese of Cambodia suffered the worst disaster ever to befall any of Southeast Asia's large ethnic Chinese communities. Of the 1975 population of 425,000, only 200,000 Chinese survived the next 4 years. Cambodia's ethnic Chinese were nearly all urban. The Khmer Rouge saw them as archetypal city dwellers and treated them as prisoners of war. Like other evacuated city dwellers, they were made to work harder and under much harsher conditions than rural dwellers. The Chinese succumbed in particularly large numbers to hunger and to diseases like malaria. The 50% of them who perished is a higher proportion even than that estimated for Cambodia's city dwellers in general, which is about 1/3. The Chinese language, like all foreign and minority languages, was banned, and so was any tolerance of a culturally and ethnically distinguishable Chinese community. Their community was destroyed as such. However, the ECCC did not prosecute this case. The Muslim Chams numbered at least 250,000, 250,000 in 1975. Just like Cambodian village life itself, the Chams' distinct Islamic religion, with their own language and culture, their large villages and autonomous networks, all that threatened the atomized, rigorously supervised society that the CPK Centre planned. An early 1974 Pol Pot document records the decision to, quote, break up the Cham people, adding, do not allow too many of them to concentrate in one area. Cham women were forced to cut their hair short in the Khmer style, not wear it long, as was their custom. Later, the traditional Cham sarong was banned as peasants were forced to wear only black pajamas. Ultimately, restrictions were placed upon religious activity. In 1975, Cham rebellions erupted. On an island in the Mekong River, the authorities attempted to collect all copies of the Quran in one village. Villagers staged a protest demonstration. Khmer Rouge troops fired into the crowd. The Chams then took up swords and knives and slaughtered half a dozen Khmer Rouge troops. The retaliating armed forces massacred many and pillaged their homes. They evacuated the island, razed the village, and then turned to a neighboring village, killing 70% of its inhabitants. From 1975 to 1979, the DK army forcibly emptied all of the 113 Cham villages in Cambodia. About 100,000 Chams were massacred, and the survivors dispersed in small groups of several families. Islamic schools and religion, as well as the Cham language, were banned. Thousands of Muslims were physically forced to eat pork. Many were murdered for refusing. Of the 113 Cham Hakam, or community leaders, 20 only survived in 1979. Only 25 of their 226 deputies survived. And you can see the other figures there for the very low survival rate amongst Cham leaders. How were these genocidal policies put into effect? Two political forces drove the mass killings and escalated them into genocide. First, the party centre. Pol Pot, Nuon Chea, Ieng Sary, and Son Sen, in particular, from their national positions of power in Phnom Penh, used the machinery of the CPK Standing Committee to push their decision-making authority forward and pursue ever more violent policies. Second, as we saw in Region 5 of the Northwest Zone, a key role was also played by MOC's Southwest Zone forces, who spread across Cambodia as they were transferred to other zones and seized power in those zones. These two political forces, the party centre and the Southwest Zone, were connected very closely. MOC himself was, of course, not just CPK Secretary of the Southwest Zone, but was also a member of the CPK Standing Committee. MOC's son-in-law, Ren, became a deputy to Son Sen at the Army General Staff in Phnom Penh. In August 2018, the ECCC's international co-investigating judge, Michael Bollander, concluded that in the central, or formerly the northern zone, quote, there was an escalation in the enforcement of CPK policy targeting the Cham following the arrival of the Southwest Zone administration. This is something we saw for the Vietnamese in the Northwest, where the Southwest Zone arrival started the targeting of Vietnamese. Now in the north, or the central zone, as it's now called, the arrival of the southwest zone started an escalation in targeting the charm. About 100 to 300 southwest zone officials arrived in the central zone in late 76 or early 1977. And Judge Bollinger wrote, quote, "The policy as applied in Kompong Cham province progressed from the suppression of the Cham religious and cultural identity to the physical destruction of the Cham population in the central zone." In other words, the judge continued, the widespread arrest and killing of Cham occurred in the central zone after the arrival of the southwest zone cadres there. Judge Bollinger indicted a leader of this group of the southwest zone cadres, Ao An, for genocide against the Cham of Kompong Cham province in the central zone. In late 76 or early 77, under Mok's orders, Ao An had transferred from the southwest zone and taken up the post of CPK Secretary of Region 41 in the central zone. And in late 1977, he became Deputy CPK Secretary of the central zone under Kai Pok. According to the indictment in 2018, after the arrival of Ao An and the southwest zone cadres, incidents of arrest and killings of Cham were targeted in at least 10 districts in the central zone, including all 5 districts in Region 41, 3 of the 4 districts in Region 42, and 2 of the 4 districts in Region 43. Judge Bollinger's indictment found that, quote, Ao An had the defining role in orchestrating and implementing the annihilation of the Cham in the central zone across Region 41 in particular, but also provided vital logistical support to the coordinated transfer of Cham from the eastern zone to Region 41, where they were killed, as everywhere else, purely because of their religious and ethnic affiliations. The killing of the Cham in Region 41 was more intense and comprehensive than other parts of the central zone. The eradication of the Cham in Ao An's sphere of influence after his installation in the central zone was relentless in its pace, the judge went on, all-encompassing in its reach, coldly methodological and merciless in its operation. At a very conservative calculation, the judge finished, a minimum of 17,115 Cham were killed in the central zone during Ao An's reign, but very likely many more, unquote. The judge's indictment sets out further how this was achieved bureaucratically. Quote, Ao An shared the special intent to destroy the Cham of Kompong Cham province through the underlying acts of killing members of the Cham population and causing them serious bodily or mental harm. He ordered the district secretaries of Region 41 to compile lists of the Cham population and ordered all the Cham to be arrested and killed. The judge went on, he ordered mass arrests of Cham people on multiple occasions and monitored the progress of the killing operation through reports provided to him. That he intended to destroy the Cham is further demonstrated by the massive scale and pattern of the killing operation carried out on his orders. Towards the end of DK, he ordered a redoubling of efforts that any remaining Cham were to be identified and listed and required an enhanced level of diligence in preparing the lists, thus showing his continuing commitment and determination to annihilate the Cham population, unquote. In its 2019 full judgment in case 2, which was the one that provided the genocide convictions, the ECCC trial chamber concluded that, quote, orders to purge the Cham in the central zone and specifically in Region 41 came from the upper echelon and were implemented through the CPK district secretaries who had come from the southwest zone, Mok's zone, and who reported to Ao An, the Region 41 secretary, who in turn reported to Kai Polk, the other zone commander warlord. The judges also concluded that, quote, meetings were held in 1977 in Region 41 discussing enemies, and not long thereafter, charms started being systematically arrested in various locations of this region based on lists that had been prepared beforehand. Orders along these lines continued to come from our armed superiors, both Mock and Kai Polk, even towards the end of DK. At a Region 41 meeting in Prechor district in late 1978, chaired by our An, he and Mock announced that people of different ethnicities were to be purged. All the district level persons responsible for lists and documentation, as well as all the sub-district chiefs of Region 41 were present at this meeting and were ordered to go to the villages directly, compile the names and make lists, making sure to record the ethnic composition of the people. At a meeting in Kompong Tom province, also in the Central Zone, in late 1978, Kai Polk urged cadres to implement the policy of Onkar, that's the CPK, to smash 100% of the charm, quote unquote. Also in late 78, another Southwest Zone leader, Mock's son-in-law, Mir Mut, arrived in Krachev province in northeast Cambodia. Since marrying Mock's daughter, Kom, Mut had risen through the ranks from his post as a district CPK secretary in the Southwest Zone to that of a region secretary, to that of a zone division commander and commander of the DK Navy. In 78, Mut became deputy secretary of the general staff of the army. In 2017, the ECCC international co-prosecutor alleged that as naval commander, Mir Mut, Mock's son-in-law, had implemented the CPK leadership's plan to completely, quote, cleanse the DK of ethnic Vietnamese, which by 1977 meant, quote, killing all Vietnamese that remained in Cambodia. Here is Mir Mut, Mock's son-in-law. The campaign of genocide by killings included the execution of many civilian fishermen and refugees captured at sea by Mir Mut's naval forces. The international co-prosecutor further alleged between 1975 and 79, Mir Mut issued orders that Vietnamese prisoners captured at sea be killed on the spot or taken to land and sent for executions. On his arrival in Krache in northeastern Cambodia in 1978, Mut not only purged that province's military and political leadership, but also, quote, continued the genocidal attack against the Vietnamese, sending Vietnamese nationals captured in Krache to S21, the central prison in Phnom Penh. Unlike Thai prisoners, whose lives could sometimes be negotiated for, where the DK saw an economic benefit in doing so, the certain death prescribed for Vietnamese captured at sea or under Mir Mut's control in Krache province indicated that they were killed simply because they were Vietnamese, unquote. The CPK centers conventional military suppression of Sao Pim's eastern zone, which neighbors on Krache province, launched by Son Sen in May 1978, also involved the participation of both Mock's Southwest Zone forces, as well as those of Polk's Central Zone. According to the ECCC's co-investigating judge, quote, beginning with the arrival of Southwest and Central Zone cadres in the Eastern Zone, witnesses describe mass arrests, disappearances, and killings of the Cham population, as well as mass transfers of people from the Eastern Zone to the Central Zone, including Cham people who were then killed in the Central Zone. Unlike the mass transfers of Cham populations earlier in the DK period, these Chams were not resettled elsewhere, but killed at a number of locations in the Central Zone. In November 2018, the ECCC trial chamber, in convicting Nguyen Chia of genocide, found that, quote, the Cham were targeted not as individuals, but based on their membership of the group. They were killed on a massive scale. In Kampong Cham province, for instance, as a result of orders from the upper echelon in the central zone, a majority of Cham from Kongmies district were arrested and brought to Wat Otrikuan in 1977, where they were executed. Then, in 1978, a great number of Cham people from Krochma district were arrested and taken to Tria Village Security Centre, located in the same district, where their membership of the Cham group was verified. Those who were deemed to be Cham were executed, while non-Cham were spared. Here again, the court found that the orders targeting these Cham came from the upper echelon, and that in both cases, the perpetrators, quote, demonstrated a genocidal mental state toward the Cham found to have been killed in those locations. The genocides of the Vietnamese and Cham groups are merely the best documented and legally adjudicated of the fates of Cambodia's ethnic minorities under the DK regime. Members of the country's Khmer Krom or Lower Khmer minority, descendants of Khmers who had migrated upstream from the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, were also hunted down and killed, particularly in 1977-78, almost as ruthlessly as were members of the ethnic Vietnamese minority. And this is well documented in the trial judgment in 2018 as well. Finally, the two cases I wanted to end with are the genocides of the part of the national group, part of the ethnic Khmer majority, and the Buddhist monkhood, also ethnic Khmers. And I'll be brief with them because time is running out, but my estimate is that between 100,000 and 250,000 ethnic Khmers were killed between May of 1978 and December of 1978, the month before the regime was overthrown on 7th of January 1979. In that suppression of the Eastern Zone, there was mass murder, probably the worst purge of the DK regime, when the targets were not only ethnic Vietnamese and Chams, but also anybody, any Khmer from the Eastern Zone. And this was an accusation, this was the accusation that was leveled against the Khmer from the Eastern Zone. They allegedly had Khmer bodies with Vietnamese heads or Vietnamese minds, Kabal Yuan Kluan Khmer. This was an example of racism turned inwards, a vicious racial introversion, if you like, that because the Sao Pim and the leadership of the Eastern Zone were distrusted and supposedly were pro-Vietnamese, the entire population who had lived under that Eastern Zone administration were suspected, and the racism of the Pol Pot regime was turned against them. In my view, this is a case of genocide against a part of a national group that meets the requirements of the Genocide Convention of intent to destroy an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group in whole or in part as such. However, the ECCC did not prosecute that case, just as it did not prosecute the case of genocide against the ethnic Chinese or the Khmer Krom, the Lower Khmers, or other ethnic groups. Also, it did not prosecute the case of the Buddhist monkhood, the religious group under the Genocide Convention. The trial chamber in 2018 rendered its judgment on charges related to Khmer Rouge crimes perpetrated against Buddhists only in a single location, which was the Tram Kok district cooperatives of Cambodia's southwest zone. This was the only charges that were laid before the trial chamber. This particular sub-district, or district, sorry, Tram Kok district in the southwest zone. And the court found indeed that Buddhism was banned, Buddhist symbols were destroyed, pagodas were emptied, and hundreds of monks were disrobed across various communes in Tram Kok district alone. the trial chamber concluded that the crime against humanity of persecution on religious grounds was committed with respect to Buddhists, unquote. It ruled that although the practice of Buddhism was banned in Trump Cop, it has not been established that monks or disrobed monks were killed in Trump Cop district. Again, that the ECCC omitted to pursue this case more broadly in relation to what happened in other parts of the country, limiting itself to just one district, is no indication whether or not genocide is an appropriate description of the fate of Buddhist victims in more than 100 other districts of Cambodia. It is nevertheless clear that not all the crimes and deaths that occurred during the DK regime constitute genocide. The 1.7 million Cambodians who perished cannot all be considered victims of genocide. As a legal matter, that crime applies only to the ethnic, national, racial, or religious groups of victims singled out for destruction as such, namely the ethnic Vietnamese, Muslim Cham, Chinese, Khmer Krom, Thai, Lao, a part of the Cambodian national groups such as the Eastern Zone Khmers and the Buddhist monkhood. The victims of mass murder who fell into political categories, such as the leaders and members of the Lon Nol regime and the officers and soldiers of the Lon Nol army, or the purged members of targeted Khmer Rouge zone administrations, or the thousands of civilian victims who were simply murdered one by one, were not victims of genocide. Yet they were victims of the same regime in the same short period as the victims of the genocides. And they were usually also victims of the same faction of the Khmer Rouge regime, the Southwest Zone administration, in concert with the CPK Centre. The Centre's use of the Southwest Zone forces as its main repressive weapon in all its murderous campaigns, genocidal and crimes against humanity, is clear. The Centre trusted Mock and his units, recruited them from the Southwest, sponsored and deployed them on deadly missions, and in 1977 and 78, sent them into the other zones of the country, purging the administrations of the Northern, Northwest, Western, and Eastern zones, significantly escalating the level of terror and mass killing there, and conducting a series of genocides against the minority groups in those zones. In this way, under the orders and with the intent and propulsion of the party centre, the Southwest Zone forces spread out all over Cambodia, bringing genocide with them. It is in this political and military sense that the 1.7 million deaths of the DK period, though not all in themselves genocidal, constitute a coherent whole. DK was a communist regime, Stalinist and Maoist in different ways. In their youth, its leaders were also influenced by Pétainist fascist agrarianism, which blended later in their careers with Maoist agrarianism. And they were also influenced by French colonial ideology, which attempted to place Cambodia in a privileged position above the other Indo-Chinese colonies, Vietnam and Laos. But most importantly, DK was also a deeply racist regime, as well as an agrarian communist regime. This led DK to commit not just crimes against humanity, but several crimes of genocide. The three mechanisms by which the regime committed these crimes were: one, control of the Standing Committee of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. This control was exerted by Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia, Ieng Sary, Son Sen, and one or two others, by bypassing and excluding two veteran leading members of the Standing Committee who occupied regional posts, Sao Pim and Ruot Nim. Standing Committee meetings in Phnom Penh regularly went ahead without the attendance of these two. These meetings were held in the name of what came to be called the Party Centre, that is, members of the Standing Committee who held exclusively national rather than regional positions. Second mechanism, there was one outstanding exception to this practice of the Party Centre excluding Standing Committee members holding regional posts, Mock, the CPK secretary of the Southwest Zone. Favoured by the party centre, Mock was not only brought into the Standing Committee, but became commander of the Revolutionary Army of DK in Phnom Penh. Mock's son-in-law, Ren, and Mir's two sons-in-law, Ren and Mir Smut, joined him on the Army General Staff. Mock's Southwest Zone and his armed forces became the powerful spearhead of the centre's violent purges and takeover of all other zones in the country. Mock's brother-in-law, Yim Tit, became acting zone secretary of the Northwest Zone. That's him there. 3, the third powerful mechanism of genocide was the compilation and deployment of lists of names. The CPK ordered lists in the forms of biographies to be drawn up all over Cambodia in order to find out every Cambodian's background, including their ethnic background. From 1977, when the Southwest Zone forces arrived in a new area, they either commissioned the research and compilation of such lists, or they used existing lists to round up and kill not only members of the old regime and supposed social classes like capitalists, but also all the ethnic Vietnamese, all the Cham Muslims, and all the Khmer Krom. The evacuated peasants from the eastern zones were already marked by being forced to wear blue scarves. They were easily visible, and they too became victims of genocide. Like many other genocides in history, the Cambodian case went along with major ambitions of territorial aggression. In 1977 and 78, while perpetrating its worst internal violence, the DK regime militarily attacked all 3 of its neighbours, Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos. In 1978, the internal violence peaked with the mass slaughter of the Eastern Zone population. 2 weeks before the centre launched its attack on the East, DK's Phnom Penh radio broadcast an appeal to, quote, purify our armed forces, our party, and the masses of the people. It went on to estimate Cambodia's population at 8 million, only 2 million of whom it proclaimed needed to be sacrificed in order to wipe out the entire Vietnamese people. Each one of us must kill 30 Vietnamese, it said. So far, we have succeeded. Vietnam has only 50 million inhabitants. We need only 2 million troops to crush the 50 million Vietnamese, and we would still have 6 million people left, unquote. That last estimate proved correct in 1979. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that very comprehensive and clarifying account of the Cambodian genocides. We ask anyone in the audience who has a question for Dr. Kiernan to please submit it via the Q&A function. And I'll begin with this question. Your lecture dealt extensively with the actions of the CPK against its people, yet how much did the militarization of Southeast Asia carry over to Cambodia? Was the catastrophe largely domestic, or did it in reality come from the outside?
That's a very good question, because much of it could not have happened without Chinese weapons. That's an element that should be stressed as well. So the Chinese, the Chinese armed and supplied all the weapons with which the genocide occurred. And they did so by also providing advisors and training the military of the Khmer Rouge, of the Revolutionary Army of Kampuchea, was Chinese armed and Chinese trained. The relationship with China was in some ways a distrustful one on the part of the Khmer Rouge, but they certainly accepted huge amounts of military weaponry and supplies, arms and ammunition, including aircraft. The Chinese built a huge airstrip in Kampong Chhnang province, which was not quite operational at the end. There's a very good book by Andrew Murtha about the Chinese relationship with DK. I think it's absolutely clear that had the Chinese not supplied all of the weapons that they did to the DK regime, the death toll would have been much lower.
Was that primarily an economic decision on the part of the Chinese? Did they do it with knowledge that many of their own people were going to be slaughtered within Cambodia?
There was one point at which in 1977, the DK published a propaganda magazine called Democratic Kampuchea is Moving Forward. I think it was in August. And in that magazine, on page 6, the regime stated that 99% of the population of the country was Khmer. And of course, that was not the accepted figure, at least before 1975. The accepted figure was 80%. And I think within a month or two, China's, the major ally of DK, quickly pointed out that the population of Khmers was, proportion of Khmers was 80%. And so they quickly drew attention to the fact that the previously accepted population of Khmers was not as high as 99%. So they, in a way, diplomatically drew attention to the fact that there were large numbers of ethnic Chinese, many of whom were already dead by 1977. But I think that was a point at which that was about all the Chinese government did to protect its ethnic Chinese. There were many ethnic Chinese who tried to approach the Chinese advisors in Cambodia for help in their plight, but they wouldn't take any action on to protect them. So the Chinese kept out of the internal affairs, as they saw it, of the Democratic Kampuchea regime. But they did make this statement that, of course, they were saying what has happened to the 19% of ethnic minorities that have been discounted or perhaps no longer survive if the proportion of Khmers is now 99% when it was previously 80%.
Yes. Was there a specific campaign against intellectuals, or were they just embraced by the campaign against urban dwellers?
It depended on the area, but in general, intellectuals were distrusted. In some areas, they were killed. I think it's not true that anybody wearing glasses was murdered, but quite a few were. Depending on the areas. Some regions of the country were more repressive than others, certainly at first. And so these certain numbers of doctors were killed. In other areas that repression and killing of doctors didn't occur. There was a variation from one region or zone to another at first. In the first couple of years, there was a lot of variation. But as the regime, with the help of the Southwest Zone, spreading out its forces all over the country, became more dominant and purged most of the zones, the picture became more monochrome and more repressive.
Do you think the genocide led by Khmer Rouge would have happened if Jayavarman VII never brought Buddhism to Cambodia? Or would there be a very similar event if Hinduism was still the main religion of the country?
Well, I think the point of the original Khmer Daum, Pol Pot seeing himself as the original Khmer, is a rejection of both Hinduism and Buddhism. That it's an attempt to return to some notional sense of pre-Buddhist, pre-Hindu, pre-Indic culture in Cambodia. It's an idea that came from Pol Pot's mentor, although I wouldn't blame Pol Pot's mentor in any way for this, because the mentor in Paris, King Van Sak, was a very thoughtful individual who was never a communist and was never a racist or somebody who would support Pol Pot. He was actually a leading figure in the Lon Nol regime rather than in the Pol Pot regime. But Pol Pot took this idea of the Cambodia having a pre-Indic past, and he ran with it in another direction, which was to reject everything that came from India, Buddhism and Hinduism. He took it from King Van Sak and distorted it, I would say. King Van Sak was a real thinker, but he was never involved with the Pol Pot group. He was a senior figure in Cambodian intellectual life who came up with this idea of Cambodia's pre-Indic culture, but he never approved of what Pol Pot was doing with that idea. And he was certainly, if he'd been in Cambodia during the Pol Pot regime, he would have been one of the first to be targeted and killed.
Would you consider the rise of nationalism as one of the major precursors to the Cambodian genocide?
I don't think so, because I think it's more of a racist regime than a nationalist regime. If you look at nationalism in Southeast Asia, it comes out of an anti-colonial wave that actually is rather a sort of a brotherhood of anti-colonial movements. There is a post-war wave of anti-colonialism that looks at other countries as in Southeast Asia as a fraternal group of countries. It's the sort of feeling that led to the formation of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, that now includes all the countries of Southeast Asia. And that formation, that feeling of fraternal nationalisms that have something in common with each other. Indonesia arose out of Dutch colonialism or anti-colonialism in the struggle against the Dutch, Vietnamese anti-colonialism against the French, the Philippines against the United States, Malaya against the British, and so on. East Timor against the Portuguese and Indonesians. The idea that we all had our colonial pasts, and that's something we share in common. Now, Cambodia had that against the French as well, but what Pol Pot's regime did was declare war against all three of its neighbors. Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos. It's the only regime to have done that, not to seek a fraternal relationship with its neighbors, but rather to close off its borders and rather to commit aggression against all three of its neighbors. The other nationalist countries, if you like, of Southeast Asia, never did that. I think it's the racism that distinguishes Cambodia, the genocides against ethnic minorities. I mean, we see it now in Burma, Myanmar, the genocide against the Rohingyas. It's very interesting that when the Pol Pot regime was in power, Ne Win, the military dictator of Burma, as it then was, visited Pol Pot's regime, who was the only head of state of another country to do so. He visited in November 1977. And he met with Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan, the two people recently convicted of genocide of the Cham in Nguyen Chia's case. He met 4 times with Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan in November of 1977, 4 times. He probably met with Pol Pot, we don't know for sure, but it wasn't announced. He then returned to Rangoon, which was then the capital of Burma, and he started preparing. We can't draw a connection with his visit to Cambodia, but he certainly started preparing Operation Naga Min, which began in February of 1978, within months, even weeks, of his November 77 visit to Pol Pot's regime in Cambodia. And by May 1978, 250,000 Burmese Muslims, Rohingya, as they're now known, had fled to Bangladesh. This was under Operation Naga Min, which was being planned within weeks of his visit to Phnom Penh. So there is a coincidence there, which is intriguing, that his 4 meetings with Nguyen Chia and Kusampon, possible meeting with Pol Pot, was followed by the first signs of expulsion of the Muslim population of Rohingyas in Burma, which in the 1990s was followed by another wave of mass expulsions, and then in the 2010s, a genocide of that same population. Whereas when he was in Cambodia, the Cambodian Muslim minority was being subjected to genocide by Nguyen Chia, who was found guilty of that, with whom he met 4 times. It's a coincidence that's very intriguing.
Maybe not a coincidence. That's very interesting. Thank you. Are there any Cham left in Cambodia today?
Yes, 1/3 of them were killed, possibly 36% in my estimate, 41% in the estimate of the French demographer who also investigated. So possibly 60% survived. A number fled after the war, after the regime ended, and went to live in Malaysia, where they were welcomed, 10 or 15,000, I believe. But most of the Cham remained in Cambodia, and they have experienced something of a revival of their religious identity and their ethnic identity. But they suffered, such an enormous destruction, not only of their 1/3 of their population or more, but of their leadership, of their hakim, their community leaders, and their learned leadership. That it's been very difficult for them to regain the customary and literate leadership that they once had. But they have certainly managed to get back on their feet again. That's certainly true.
Do you have any film suggestions that you feel clearly and accurately depict the genocide?
The films of Riti Pan, Rithypanh, very well known and very widely acclaimed. There's a good book about the films of Riti Pan and others called Perpetrator Cinema by Raya Morag. I think it came out last year. Perpetrator Cinema, very much worth reading, and she discusses a number of the films that have been made in Cambodia or by Cambodians in France and elsewhere. And she classifies these films as a new wave of cinema, which she calls perpetrator cinema, which is a certain initiative, a new pioneering form of cinema by Cambodians. It's partly because the overthrow of the regime so quickly by the Vietnamese army enabled Cambodians to come face to face with some of the perpetrators, and even to engage them in films and to confront them in films. And Ritipan has done that. S21, which is the name of the prison, he has a film named S21. And Raya Morag shows how this is a new type of film. It's different from Holocaust cinema, and it's a new type of global cinema that is an initiative coming out of the Cambodian genocide, that in which victims and perpetrators victims confront the perpetrators, largely because of the rapidity with which the Vietnamese overthrew the regime, leaving it in power only for four years. And there are also a number of other Cambodian filmmakers. I remember seeing a film in Phnom Penh in the early 80s by Yvonne Hem, but I haven't seen it mentioned in the discussions about Cambodian film, recent discussions. But I thought it was quite good at the time. Maybe in the late 80s it was made in Phnom Penh. I'd like to see if that film is still around.
How thorough is Cambodia's recovery? Are they still deeply haunted by this genocide, which is relatively recent? Is there trust in their society? Is there resilience?
Well, one of the reasons for the tribunal was hopefully to build on some kind of reconciliation based on justice. I'm not sure that that's really happened because some of the people that I discussed in my presentation, Yim Tit, Mirmut, and Ao An, their cases didn't proceed. They were stymied by the regime. The big cases did proceed. The big fish were put on trial and judged. Yang Sari died before his case could be completed. Mok died he died in jail before his case came to court. Kai Polk died a free man after defecting to the government. Duke was convicted and died in jail, as did Nguyen Chia after being convicted of genocide. Kusampon is still in jail and has appealed his sentence, but is serving a sentence for genocide. But some of the others have not been brought to justice, and a large number of other lower ranking Khmer Rouge have escaped justice. Many of them, however, escaped justice in a way that, in the sense that they were subjected to re-education, imprisonment without trial. During the civil war that followed the overthrow of the Khmer Rouge regime, they were captured, and I estimate tens of thousands, perhaps 40,000 Khmer Rouge were captured by the Vietnamese or by the Cambodian army, and just given prison sentences in re-education camps, prison camps, and held for 3 months, 6 months, sometimes 18 months, sometimes years without trial. So in one sense, it would have been an injustice to retry them. And indeed, they were not ever tried, but they were given sentences that were, in some sense, without trial, and they went back to their villages. In some ways, the people that they are living side by side with are their victims, but they are recognized as having done time. So there's a sense that reconciliation has been observed, or that some sense of justice, even in a non-legal sense, an illegal sense, has been served. A large number of people have been given extra legal sentences. So whether that means that reconciliation has been achieved or not is another thing. It's now 40 years since the end of the 42 years since the end of the Khmer Rouge regime. It's very difficult to know what young people think about the Khmer Rouge regime, whether they want to move on now. The regime now, the Hun Sen regime, is now very close to China, which was the main backer of the Khmer Rouge.
And of course, most infamously, Pol Pot never came to justice.
No, he died in his sleep, being at that time protected by Thailand, China, the United States.
Dr. Kiernan, thank you very much again for visiting with us this evening. We're so glad we finally got you to show up at Sonoma State in the lecture series, and we hope to have you again.
Thank you very much.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you.